Thank you for attending our session on SaaS security. So we're actually going to cover a couple things with SaaS security. We're going to talk about it, why does it even matter? What are the risks associated with SaaS security? What are those unknowns that maybe some of us, don't know much about? And then what can we do about them? My name is Renee Gutman. I'm a former CISO. I was a CISO for Coca-Cola, Time Warner, Campbell's. And I will tell you that, in the last couple of years, I've learned a lot more about what can go wrong as it relates to SaaS. And we're here to talk about that. But more importantly, to leave you with some ideas for what you can implement after you leave this session. So let me turn it over to Alfredo Hickman, my co-presenter.
Thank you so much, Renee. My name is Alfredo Hickman. I'm the CISO at Obsidian Security. I've been with the company now for going on 7 years, and it's my pleasure to be here with you all and share a little bit about our story and how we think about SaaS security and leave you with some of those nuggets that Renee was talking about to be able to take back to your organizations. So thank you so much for being with us today. And that leads me to why we are talking about SaaS security. I think by show of hands here, how many of us here in the room are using SaaS applications in their organizations? That's everybody, right? By show of hands, how many of you feel that you have a really good handle on the security and governance of those applications? That tends to be less. And then when we actually get in the environment and we see what's really what, eyes tend to open, right? So what we're here to do is basically share with you some of our experiences and insights that we've aggregated at Obsidian over the course of the last 7 years, securing our customers and seeing some of the most relevant, kind of most critical attacks and risks as it pertains to our SaaS applications and organizations. So one of the great benefits that we have at Obsidian is that over the course of the last years, Obsidian has had a privileged perspective in some of the most complex deployments of SaaS applications globally, some of the largest organizations globally, and then through our partners and some of the premier incident response firms on the planet to be able to directly see attackers and hackers, how they go about exploiting our SaaS applications. And one of the big lessons or big pieces of information that we've gleaned over the course of the years is that a lot of it is coming back to identities. According to our data, what we have seen is about 85% of the breaches of enterprise SaaS applications in one way, shape, or another has to do with compromises of human and non-human identities. Now, I think a lot of this really goes back to the human link being kind of the weakest link in the chain. Oftentimes the proliferation of federated identities, when you have access to an application, the paths of access tend to kind of, we accrue more access than less. And for various reasons, we see, that 85% of breaches relate to compromises of human and non-human identities. And also, probably even more disturbing than that, is the dwell time associated with threat actors in our SaaS applications. So if you look at, say for example, the advancements that we've made in endpoint security, where, in the course of the last 10 years, we've been basically able to take dwell times, going from a year to now, we're talking about days and even hours in terms of discovering threat actors in our endpoint environments. In SaaS, we've almost gone back 10 years in time. Partially because of the governance, partially because of visibility and technical controls to be able to see what is happening in these environments. We're seeing dwell times that take us back about 10 years, right? Where adversaries are spending on average 240 days embedded in our SaaS application ecosystem before being detected. And that is clearly a huge problem.
And this slide really just shows that SaaS breaches are going to continue to increase. Most people said they had some form of SaaS in their environment when Alfredo asked that question. Depending on what report you read, and I read a couple. So it was either a $100 billion market for SaaS in 2018 going to $400 billion in 2028. And I read another report that said the SaaS market's at $3 trillion right now, going to $10 trillion by 2030. So the reality is a lot of our critical systems, are basically now SaaS. A lot of our critical data is in SaaS. And that's why, frankly, the attackers think that's a pretty lucrative place to go play. right? So that slide shows some of the logos. However, we are in Canada, so let's click that. Alfredo, we needed to put a Canadian slide up here.
Absolutely.
So in 2024, apparently this, I think it came out of a report, if you look at the bottom right, it said a third of companies in Canada have suffered some type of SaaS breach. And a lot of it's because they're not known to the organization. You know, a quarter of those apps might actually be what's called sanctioned. 75% of them might have come through maybe on a credit card or, you know, not known even to procurement. And at least half of those apps are probably not even known to the security department. So there's a gap in visibility that organizations are facing, which is why, again, no shame, right? When we ask the question, how many people feel like they've got a handle on this? Most people don't. And that's why we're talking about this today. So let's go to the next slide. Why is this so hard? Okay, why is SaaS so complex? It's complex. I'm going to start at the top because, you know, when I was a CISO, I knew I had Workday, I knew I had Salesforce. What I didn't know is that there were probably at least 70 other SaaS apps connected into my Salesforce environment. O365, maybe a couple thousand, or at least 1,000. So you can see the core system, okay, that somebody probably paid for, that everybody knows is there in the company, like a Workday or a Salesforce or a ServiceNow. But you don't see all the stuff that's in the background running behind it. And the reason that those systems are supporting Workday, for example, because they add a lot of incremental functionality that the business clients who have brought those apps in the first place, they want that capability, but it doesn't come out of the actual core application itself. So you have a lot more, you know, again, numbers, fun with numbers. You probably have 500 SaaS apps, and you might think you have, and that's what that previous Canadian slide said. You know, you might think you've got 10, but you might have 100, you know, connected or more connected to your O365. So, you know, it's just a lot of interconnected apps that are not that are supporting those core systems that everybody knows about. The second thing is, you know, a lot of these systems were brought in by stakeholders, and even if Workday was known to you, maybe somebody brought in a system to augment the Workday application, but that is not known to you. That might be known to the business partner, you know, that cut the deal. And I'm going to get on a little soapbox, okay? My soapbox is I was a CISO when COVID happened. I was so busy worried about connectivity, you know, and making sure that everything, you know, people could do their job. I worried about the fact that we stopped changing passwords, you know, because we're like, oh my God, everybody's going to have a password failure, you know, and so we didn't really support our business, I believe, in the way that we could have, because we were too focused on the basics of infrastructure. And that's really, I think, the period when SaaS itself took off, and the business, they still needed to get their jobs done. So they went and they subscribed to these different applications. And that's why, you know, half of them are probably not known to security and maybe 75% not known to procurement. The final thing that makes SaaS so complex is that they're not even just used anymore by, you know, the people that are, you know, true employees of your business. They're used by other, you know, organizations, and you don't have a lot of control over them. So it just leads to a lot of, you know, what Chris talked about this morning, I believe, was just that it's a big, complex environment that we're trying to get our arms around. All right, and that's kind of the world of SaaS today for most companies. The next slide, all right, I'm going to flip back to Alfredo. I'm going to ask him the silly question. Well, Alfredo, you know, aren't there security solutions in my environment today that are going to help me? Like, tell me,
Absolutely.
Are there control gaps that maybe all of these things that I've paid a lot of money for are not going to be able to deliver for me?
Spoiler alert, there are, definitely. So I remember, I'll share with you a quick story. When I first started working on the SaaS security problem was back in 2017. Prior to joining Obsidian, I led security product engineering at a company called Rackspace, where we were building a global managed security service. And like many of the Rackspace customers, especially at the time, they were embarking on digital transformation, and they were looking to us to provide them fanatical support regardless of where they were, either on the data center or in their journey to the adoption of cloud services. So as many of our organizations have done, we migrated from on-prem into AWS and Azure and GCP and so forth. And even though those environments were different and unique, a lot of the conceptual methods for securing those environments remained the same, right? We understood we had clearly defined models of shared security responsibility, where we understood that the cloud security provider was responsible for security of the cloud. We as customers and security professionals were responsible for security in the cloud, right? That paradigm fundamentally fell apart as our organizations moved up the application stack, or moved up the infrastructure stack into software as a service applications, right? You could no longer take existing technologies, innovate with them, and use them in novel ways to secure those applications, because you couldn't put an endpoint agent on Salesforce. You couldn't throw a Palo Alto firewall at Workday or GitHub or whatever, right? You fundamentally lost access to those applications to be able to understand their composition and capabilities of control to secure those applications. Not only, and not to discount the fact that your mileage may vary, while some applications had more defined capabilities, others had none whatsoever when it came to securing those applications. None of them were integrated amongst your entire SaaS ecosystem. And as Renee mentioned in the previous slide, many of the same attributes that are the reason why SaaS is so valuable, the ease of deployment, the reduction in friction of integration, the ease of administration, not having to worry about the underlying infrastructure, many of those things that we find so valuable are the same things that introduce those challenges and those risks into our organization. So another story. When I first started working on the SaaS security problem, we tried to use our existing technologies. We tried to use our SIEM, we tried to use our CASB, we tried to use our identity provider, and I will never forget receiving a $10 million Splunk licensing bill. I did not have to worry about the underlying infrastructure because Papa Rackspace paid for that, but we still had to pay for the licensing of our software, and we knew very quickly two things. The aggregation, the collection and aggregation of data is a cost center until you extract the value from that. And that is very, very expensive and requires a lot of specialized knowledge and expertise in those particular applications. So very quickly, we discovered that we needed tooling and a capability set to be able to secure these applications in a way that was highly tailored and specialized for that operating domain. Because at the end of the day, SaaS is just another operating domain, not unlike our endpoint fleets in the physical layer, not unlike infrastructure tier in the cloud service providers, not unlike our networks. It's just another domain. And this leads me to a model that most of us here are probably familiar with, the Swiss cheese model of hazard and risk. And another lesson that I'll share with you here, I come from a pretty extensive operational security background. I grew up in the Defense Department. I grew up in GWAT. I grew up doing not cyber, I grew up doing counterterror in the Marine Corps, but I very quickly got exposed to intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance. And what we discovered, one of the things that we always worked on was acknowledging our biases and acknowledging the things that we knew we didn't know, right? Because there's infinitely more that we don't know than what we do know. And the hazard and risk model basically posits that gaps in people, process, and technology, when exploited by threat actors, realize actual hazard to our organizations. So one of the lessons that I've taken is that governance in many ways is analogous to shift left in the context of SaaS security. In application security and vulnerability management, If we're believers in shift left, we know that we can get at the composition, the dependencies, the vulnerabilities that we are generated and deploy into our environments as early as possible in their life cycle. It tends to be cheaper, less disruptive, less stressful for us to resolve that, right? In SaaS, we oftentimes do not have that access or purview into the composition, into the implementation, into the configuration, into the posture of the back-end applications and infrastructure that we consume as SaaS applications. So you lose a lot of visibility. You can do point-in-time third-party risk assessments, and I encourage you to do that. You can do pen tests and so forth, but dynamic, real-time understanding of the threat activity and composition starts to fall apart. So regardless of technology, what I advise my fellow CISOs, my fellow security professionals, and our customers is work very closely with those GRC teams, with those third-party risk management teams, with legal and finance, and introduce the hooks into your security and governance process as early as possible. Because even though SaaS is very rapid to deploy, you can purchase it with your credit card, use your corporate email, create a new subscription. One thing that they all have in common is somebody has to pay for that, right? I guarantee you that even if someone is using their personal credit card, they probably want to get reimbursed for that, right? If they're using it for work purposes. So if you introduce your hooks into those GRC, into the procurement and finance process, a lot of times you can surface those applications. So that leads me to the attack surface, the unique attack surface of the SaaS application operating domain. Your install base, the integrations, something that Renee alluded to. These SaaS applications are platforms. Almost all of them have robust marketplaces with dozens or hundreds of third-party integrations, each one of which you can usually deploy with the click of a button, a token, an API token, an OAuth grant, and so forth. And now that integration becomes your new fourth party, potentially a data sub-processor, potentially moving data outside of your localization boundaries, your authorization boundaries, and so forth. And now you, by proxy of that SaaS application, are exposed to the surface area, permission sets, data transfers, and such of those fourth parties. The identities that we talked about, and I'll dive a little bit deeper when we start getting into the kill chain here. Service accounts. Another thing that we've learned at Obsidian through our purview in having this deep insight into SaaS security is that non-human identities on average generate 10 times the amount of data than human identities. So the integrations that you use to integrate those third-party integrations are doing a lot in the background to process and move data, oftentimes without any visibility into your environment. And then support access. A lot of these SaaS applications give the providers the ability to be able to log in to provide legitimate support services, but what happens when those accounts are compromised, those features are exploited, or you leave them unattended and they're inadvertently exploited, right? Insider risks and so forth. And that leads me to the anatomy of a SaaS kill chain. So as I mentioned at the beginning of this presentation, there is a lot to factor when it comes to SaaS security, but if you take a threat-centric approach and you understand that your maximum return on investment in terms of controls to manage risk associated with SaaS, 85% is in initial access through the compromise of human and non-human identities. A lot of times threat actors will specifically target the identity providers still through social engineering attacks like password resets, and so forth, spear phishing and so forth, will target those identity providers because the first thing that they do when they compromise those identities is look at the catalog of applications that identity has access to and start to open all of the applications. We see this all the time. We have the ability to see what is happening in these incidents, and threat actors, as soon as they compromise that identity, boom, clicking through all of the different federated, the SAML apps and so forth that user may have access to. Second thing that we see is almost an immediate pivot into the internal organization's wikis. This was another thing that was kind of news to me that I thought was kind of interesting when I first started seeing this in our incident response engagements, right? You would think that immediately they would start to look for, I don't know, databases, GitLab or GitHub projects and repos and so forth. But what we discovered was reconnaissance in SaaS oftentimes leads the adversary to our wiki repos, our Confluence and Notion pages, because as they so happen to be, a very rich set of compiled documentation that basically explains your entire organization to the threat actor. So we give our adversaries basically very well documented access into the environment.
Yeah, I mean, I was at one presentation. It said, look, that the attackers don't need to figure out anything new. They just use your own tools against you. Right?
Absolutely.
And it's not like there's nothing published about this stuff, right?
Absolutely. Living off the land in the context of SaaS exploitation tends to mean compromise of identity provider and a lot of times the knowledge repos and the data repositories. So the services like Snowflakes, like Databricks, like your source code repositories and such. And then obviously pivoting to the network layer as well. This is one of the fascinating things for me personally as a security professional responsible for the security of Obsidian. I will never forget when we developed the endpoint integration to tie in what we were seeing or what our partners were seeing, our endpoint security partners were seeing at the endpoint, tying it in to pivoting of adversaries from the endpoint into the SaaS application ecosystem, and then vice versa, pivoting with identities that they compromise from SaaS apps into the end user fleet. It was amazing for us to be able to see kind of the provenance of those attacks. And then obviously the impact, the exhortation, the financial fraud, business email compromises, the taking down of services, the loss of trust and so forth that comes with the exploitation of these systems, right? Intellectual property and so forth that is oftentimes housed in these applications.
Before you leave this slide, Chris Roberts used the word devastation today in terms of real impact. And I've heard it said in other sessions, right? I mean, we're talking about resiliency, and we're not talking anymore about just, okay, well, my stock price is going to recover in such a period of time. We're talking about the fact that hospitals, I had this discussion with somebody that runs a fairly significant hospital. I said, do you use SaaS? And the answer was no. Well, the answer is absolutely yes. I mean, they use ServiceNow sometimes for like patient booking, for scheduling surgeries. And we're talking now the fact that we've now taken SaaS apps, right, and things that we trusted on-prem, we put them in the cloud, and now we're impacting, people's sense of well-being. There's actually some people now that are starting to track the number of deaths that have been caused because a hospital couldn't, take in a patient, or they couldn't schedule a surgery, or they had to be, transported a couple 100 miles down the road. So again, why are we talking about this? Because we've now taken our critical systems, put them in SaaS, and we just don't have the same type of understanding that we did for when we ran systems on-prem. And I can remember, early on when we put in a SaaS app, and I was just told by my CIO, well, of course they can do better security than we can. Of course we should just trust it. And the reality is, again, that's the whole purpose of this conversation today, is how we as security practitioners need to really engage in this space called SaaS that's still somewhat unknown. So I'll let you go to the next slide.
Absolutely. And as I mentioned before, and I think it bears kind of revisiting here, so we talked about in aggregate 85% of the compromises that we see resulting from compromises of human and non-human identities, but the actual breakdown so that it can make, enable you to make better informed decisions when it comes time to investing in technical controls. I mean, you see 39% of identity compromises in the context of SaaS resulting from traditional spear phishing and adversary in the middle proxies. So adversary in the middle proxy is obviously, kind of immune to some of the training benefit that we get from empowering our employees to be able to resist social engineering. But it's extremely important because we see these tokens that we talked about the integrations, right? A lot of times the integrations made amongst the SaaS applications are done with the end user's identity. And a lot of times it's done with their administrative identity. So when you spearfish or you are able to extract that token via, like say for example, a reverse proxy, now you are compromising any SaaS application that was done with that identity in the context of the permissions that was used to establish that integration. So that ends up becoming hugely important when it comes time to prioritizing remediation. SIM swapping, and self-service password resets. What I have started advising, and probably some of the same thing that you all do as well, is SIM-based multi-factored authentication is the weakest form of multi-factored authentication. At this point, it has become trivial to be able to clone SIMs, to be able to exploit the logic behind SMS-based multi-factored authentication. So at Obsidian, one of the things that we've done ourselves is we just completely disabled that across the board. We don't even allow SMS-based, voice-based password resets and so forth. You all have probably seen, and we'll talk a little bit about AI security and how we're thinking about securing AI services that are delivered as SaaS. But now, you see that with just relatively small samples of a person's voice and video, we're able to generate likenesses that even trained professionals are failing to identify as fraudulent, right? That makes, the like MGM breach, compromising social engineering help desk staff for password resets and such, that makes that even more important to be able to get ahead of, right? And you can see for yourself the rest of that kind of breakdown. Yep.
Yeah. You know what? I'll give you a minute on this one or less, because we're going to run out of time to give people some ideas for what they can actually do about this problem.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm glad to take any questions right now or at any point if you all want to stop me. But scattered spidered, right? We just talked about the MGM breach. Obsidian was really fortunate to have to be directly involved in that incident. And what we saw was exactly what I was just talking about before, right? These adversaries exploiting weaknesses in the organization to be able to social engineer our staff into providing them legitimate access into the compute environment, right? And then pivoting into the resources that those identities had access to, which in the context of an administrative, help desk can tend to be quite a lot, right? So persistence, reconnaissance, lateral movement, exfiltration, leading to ransomware. These kill chains, they're pretty much the same kind of kill chains that we see in other operating domains, only with the unique kind of considerations that come about from the SaaS estate, right? Service-to-service integration, wide-ranging access, administration typically done outside of a central IT organization, security and such, if it's even being done, a lot of times being left to implementation at the functional unit level. And another thing that Renee mentioned, we talked about the proliferation of unfettered or unsanctioned SaaS applications, not just unique SaaS applications, but case in point, we were just working with a customer recently where we were doing a proactive assessment. They told us that based on their CMDB and their asset inventory, they believed that they had 12 instances of Salesforce. When we got in there, it turned out they had 25 instances of Salesforce. And we see this sort of thing happen all the time, right? So
quickly, we're going to switch into like what can be done. We're going to wrap up in 3 minutes. I promise you. I do. Chris talked about this today. MITRE, no surprise, has already developed, a MITRE attack framework for, how this really works. And so the industry's waking up, right, to the fact that SaaS is a problem. Next slide, please. What can we do? Well, you can do a lot, right? You can try to understand, from procurement who's paying stuff on a credit card. But the reality is it's hard work, okay? I think that anything here, you can discover your apps, but the chances of you finding the whole breadth as well as the extensions that we've talked about, Workday exists. You don't know about the other 70 things that are connected to Workday. But you can try, okay? I'm not saying you can't. But you got to do something, all right? That's the whole purpose of this conversation, is about you really do need to do something, even if you do start with some of the basic hygiene. The only comment that I want to make is that because SaaS is actually managed by non-IT people generally, You cannot go about this thing with a stick and go, I'm going to beat you now that you've basically done this. You do have to create that shared responsibility, that partnership model, or I don't think anything's going to work right for you. You cannot just alienate an entire business because they chose to go off and actually deliver things for their business while we were too busy running around with infrastructure. That's my 2 cents on this. I'm going to let Alfredo talk about how SaaS solutions can help, and then I do want to get to the question, if that's okay.
Absolutely, yeah. Just one thing that I also want to leave you with: discovery of your SaaS install base. Red teaming exercises. Red teaming exercises are phenomenal if you really kind of take a full spectrum approach to the way that you do red team engagements. Have that adversary come in, have that organization come in, take the gloves off, really attack you like an adversary, and oftentimes, if you have the thick skin to kind of deal with the findings, you'll see that there's a lot that you might have not been aware of. That MITRE attack framework for SaaS, one of the things that I do as we're creating scenarios for the red teaming engagements is that I systematically cover all of those kill chain phases so that I know that we're periodically rotating through the entire set of TTPs there, and that we have better coverage. So how can SaaS security solutions mitigate the risk? Well, it goes back to having that purpose-built technology, that purpose-built weapon system or platform that is designed specifically to deliver that set of outcomes in that unique operating domain. So taking a holistic approach to your SaaS install base, having a comprehensive capability set around posture, threat detection, identity security, the integration risk management piece, the governance umbrella that becomes your controls environment in that operating domain, having that unified capability set to secure your SaaS estate becomes hugely important and becomes a differentiator in your security programs to give your teams, that ability to secure those assets. So things, all of the different things, posture, securing multi-factor authentication policies, insecure configurations and integrations, stale accounts and so forth, the ability to detect suspicious or malicious activity both inside the wire and outside, kind of targeting those applications. As Renee talked about, a lot of time the consumers of these applications are your contractors, they are your professional services support teams, they are your support personnel and so forth. So being able to have that integrated contextualized view of insider and external risk is a game changer.
And so SaaS security solutions, SaaS security posture management, that's sort of the category that Gartner puts everything in. And we're here with Obsidian. Obsidian has a booth, and I would encourage you to visit them. They also are detective capabilities, telling you if something, if some access is inappropriate. But the final piece, everybody has an AI governance initiative that I have talked to recently. These solutions, like Obsidian, can tell you. They can actually go in and identify the context of an app and tell you, oh yeah, this tool uses AI, it uses PII. All right, these are the people that are using it. So if your organization, if you can't sell the story maybe on why you have to protect SaaS applications, then wrap it into your AI governance program, because everybody has one of those going on right now, and it'll help you not to, wind up with privacy violations or, SaaS apps that use AI that violate your policies for AI. I'll get to the question. You still have it?
Yeah. So just wondering, what's the major difference between SaaS security posture management and like secure web gateway, or like that are typical of SASE or CASB solutions?
Absolutely. So first, and I'm probably going to say something that may be controversial, this is the benefit of not being a sales professional and actually being a CISO at Obsidian. I actually really dislike the term SSPM. SSPM was something that Gartner created to try to put us in a little box. We have a far more comprehensive and expansive view on what it means to be able to secure SaaS in a comprehensive manner. Posture is really important, but it's just one piece of that capability set. Web Gateway CASB. CASB is a great tool to secure access at the perimeter edge. It loses all visibility and contextualization once you get past perimeter edge access, and even more so when you start integrating SaaS applications amongst each other. You just have no insight and purview into the activity the state, the permissions, the roles, the integrations and data flows and such that you really need once you get past authorized access or such.
And I think we'll be happy to talk to you about that, because that's actually a really great question that comes up a lot, which is, it goes back to, I've got 1,000 tools already. What are you telling me that I still need one more tool or one more solution, that is, in some level, dedicated towards SaaS security? So thank you for that question.
Absolutely.
Please visit the folks at the Obsidian security booth. It's on the second floor, and we'd love to talk to you more about. I think this is a huge problem, like I said, and that's one of the reasons that I'm working with Obsidian. So thank you so much.
Yeah, and I'll be down there as well for a little while. So I've been using this product. My teams have been using this product now for over 7 years, since before it even had a GUI. So any questions about implementation, operationalization of the technology, your controls environment, Obsidian, how we think about securing our own platform and customer trust in terms of the customers that entrust us with their security and such, I'm happy to answer any of those questions.
Thank you.
Thank you.